stream's not ending just yet. No, we're still going for just a little bit. I have a question. When did you start playing video games? What year? How old were you? Actually, that's a better question. How old were you when you started playing video games? How long have you played video games for? Too early to remember. That's probably about the same for me. I reckon the first... So, this is gonna sound really sad. My very first video game was Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. Now, let me just briefly, if I look up Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, is it going to show up? That's actually a good explanation of how most people feel about the game. Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. What happened? What happened? It was not a good Spyro game. It was, yeah. So, I've been playing games since I was probably like 5 or so, I reckon. What year did that game come out? Maybe that'll give us a better indication. Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. Okay, 2002. So yeah, I was probably like 5 or 6 when I started playing games. Not long after that, I played Kingdom Hearts and other things like that. So I have a fairly big background in gaming. But what are games like for someone who doesn't play games? I watched maybe like the first 2 minutes of this just to get a vibe for it, and I definitely want to check it out. So let's see how it goes.
Last year, the lady I live with, also known as my wife, asked if she could try out one of the games I've been playing. She described it as the one with the cute little ghost guy, and after scrolling through my entire library, I realized she was talking about Hollow Knight. Given the fact that her experience
what a game to put someone on as like one of their first video games. Like that's a rough one. Like Hollow Knight's great, but Hollow Knight's a little bit of a challenge. Like, even if you're used to gaming, getting used to Hollow Knight is rough, especially when you start doing some of the more complex things, like, some of the areas that require pogoing, for example. That's difficult, even for someone who is used to playing games.
Video games at that point consisted of the occasional race in Mario Kart and a smattering of Crash Bandicoot levels from when she was a kid. I knew-
what is the song I use my outro since I asked last time? Do you mean this one? That is a remix of the Temple OS hymn. If you look up, actually, what was the full name of it that says here? If you look up Temple OS Hymn Risen by Dave Eddy, you will find it.
With fair confidence that her playing Hollow Knight would go terribly. So
yeah, that's how I would feel as well.
It up and set her into the world of Hallow Nest. As she played, every moment, regardless of how seemingly insignificant, had a strange sort of intensity to it. For example, in the tutorial there are a set of platforms that the player needs to jump across. The only penalty for falling is a little bit of time, and on my first playthrough I breezed past it and immediately forgot about it.
Yeah, what happened in my first playthrough is I tried to breeze past it and then I fell off because I'm bad at platformers.
It was intense beyond belief. She wasn't sure what the penalty for falling would be, and she didn't have a full grasp on how to adjust her jump height and distance. Each successful jump felt like a triumph, and after landing, she'd look out at the next platform, searching for the nerve to jump again.
Who was a better gamer? This guy's wife? Or the guy who reviewed Cuphead? Because I think I might know which one.
Watching her work through this early section and seeing the different ways that she viewed the game got me thinking a lot about the language of video games and just how much a person's level of video game literacy affects their experience with any given title. I can't really think of a time in my life where I wasn't interested in games, and because of that, there are certain aspects about them that are almost instinctual to me now. And that's because a lot of games use the same ideas and vocabulary in order to get information across to players as quickly as possible. It's why the color red is almost always associated with health, why the A button or its equivalent is typically the command to jump, and why platformers more often than not have players moving from left to right. At this point, I've played enough games where after 5 minutes of trying a new one, I almost always know what to expect, no matter the kind of game. But that inherent understanding of how games work and what to expect from them doesn't exist for the lady I live with because she hasn't spent the time learning those things. And this made me wonder. How do people learn the basics of video games?
This is something I've not seen in a very, very long time. Jesus.
So I decided to run an informal experiment where I'd have her play a handful of titles.
Do not put someone who's new to gaming on Monster Hunter World, for the love of God. Please tell me this is just demonstration, and you don't have someone new to gaming play World.
And see how she approached figuring each one of them out in the hopes of getting a better understanding of how people learn the language.
10, fucking great game.
In an effort to not influence how she approached any given title, I didn't give her any advice or instructions. I just watched, silently judging. I had her play through the early sections of 9 games. Super Mario Bros., Shovel Knight, Celeste, Portal, Doom.
Okay, it's the early section of Celeste. Okay, that's still in the range of like normal people playing a video game. Late Celeste is where things get real bad.
Skyrim, The Last of Us, Uncharted 2, and so that I could really test the strength of our marriage, Dark Souls. I picked.
If you aren't used to Dark Souls, you can completely fail during the tutorial. FPS for a non-gamer is a challenge. I'm very curious to see how that goes. Depending on also whether she plays on controller or keyboard and mouse.
I picked these titles because A, I felt there would be a solid sampling of 3 major types of games, those being 2D platformers, 3D platformers, and first-person shooters/adventures, while also offering a diverse spread of genres and gameplay mechanics. And B, I like them. So,
fair.
This is how it went.
Well, I guess we know how the test went.
With each game, I noticed that there were a vast amount of seemingly basic functions and mechanics that she either didn't fully grasp or know existed. This first came up with Mario 1-1. She figured out the jump easily enough, but never realized she had the ability to dash, making her time with the level painfully hard to walk.
Now, I didn't realize you could dash in Mario for a very, very long time. For like, probably until I played like the Wii release of Mario, did I realize you could dash. Yeah. Best game for a new gamer to start with, in your opinion? Honestly, like some sort of mascot platform is probably easy enough. It's chill. It's like fun. Like whether it be Banjo-Kazooie or anything else like that, I think is easy enough. Stardew Valley, if you want, like, yeah, sure, Stardew Valley if you want someone who can just approach something. Like, Stardew Valley is less of a game, it's more of a spreadsheet, right? I think it depends on what you're trying to do with it, I guess. It also really depends on the kind of person, like, what sort of vibes they have. What do they like from, like, movies and TV shows and stuff like that, right? Because if someone only watches, like, Michael Bay movies, if you give them Stardew Valley, that's probably not the best of suggestions. Or Animal Crossing. Probably not the best of suggestions. I would say, like, I think a safe bet is just a mascot platformer. Mascot platformers are easy. and Michael Bay viewer, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Michael Bay is making the Skibbity movie. I'm aware, yes.
There are no in-game instructions on how to dash or do anything else really. So players will only learn about it if they read the instruction manual, figure it out through experimentation, or have another person tell them how it works. As she didn't even know it was something she could do, she never figured it out. For me, it has become second nature to try to sprint in games, whether or not I know it's an option. I just assume it will be and guess the command will probably be the B button or its equivalent. But
Usually it's something like hold down the stick. Pretty much every game that, like, that's the default usually. Unless it's like, unless it's using like Souls-like logic where the dodge and run are on the same button. Usually hold down stick is going to do something. Sometimes it's some other weird combination, like it's Black Myth Wukong where it's on R1. I'm probably going to rebind the controls in Black Myth because the controls make no sense. I don't know who designed them. I don't know why they're designed like that.
I only make that assumption because of years of being conditioned to make it. Figuring out the controls for all of the games, whether they were explicitly explained or implicitly taught through level design, was a challenge for her. Part of this stems from her not being all that comfortable with a controller. Anytime a game asked for her to press a certain button, she'd look down at the controller and search for it. One of the most memorable instances of this came up while playing The Last of Us. Early on,
I'm like that with a keyboard. I'm not great. I should be better at typing, but I'm really not.
Prompt on the screen to press L3, which she couldn't find on the controller as there is no button labeled L3. She noticed it was shaped like a circle, so she guessed it might be one of the joysticks. However, she didn't know that it meant to press down on it, so she just sort of moved back and forth until eventually figuring it out. I've certainly played games that do a better job of illustrating.
I definitely have had that experience in my own life before, the first time I ran across like an L3 or R3 press.
Illustrating how L3 and R3 work, but it is kind of weird that there's pretty much a hidden button on all controllers that new players will have no reason to know exists. Figuring out a game's controls sounds easy, but she essentially not only had to memorize which buttons did what, but also which buttons were where, adding another layer of things to keep track of and making the process a little bit more overwhelming. She typically fared better.
I guess that's when you play as a kid, you kind of just like button mash a lot, and you kind of just work it out, right? Like if you're a 5-year-old playing, I don't know, Spyro, you work out a lot of things pretty quickly, just intuitively. I still button mash a lot. Yes, this is why I don't play fighting games.
With games that didn't give too much information to remember. With Dark Souls, after reading 15 or so messages explaining the controls, she said she felt like she was getting too much information too quickly. A lot of the things she learned, most notably the lock-on feature, she forgot about by the time they would actually be useful. On the other side of things, with Shovel Knight, she struggled to get through a few of the early sections because she didn't understand the full scope of her abilities or how to use them, but once she did start to figure things out through experimentation, she ended up remembering the core mechanics better because she witnessed firsthand how useful they could be. So for her at least, giving a memorable use of a mechanic,
I've not played Shovel Knight
before. A lot clearer.
I should do that at
Most
some
of the
point.
games I had her play were with a controller, but I did want her to have some experience with mouse and keyboard. So I had her try a few games with a first-person
You are evil.
perspective. I thought Portal would be the best place to start as it
Maybe for someone who's not a moron. I am very bad at puzzle games.
doesn't call for quick reflexes, and it gives players time to figure things out. Using the keyboard actually proved to be easier for her than the controller, as she uses a keyboard every day and knows where everything is.
Right,
However,
right.
if you've been paying attention to the footage, you've probably noticed that she isn't looking around at all. And that's because she didn't realize she was supposed to use the mouse.
That's actually kind of cute. Oh, okay. No, I guess that's another thing, right? Like, when you first play a PC game as a kid, you just mess around with shit. Like what was the first PC game I don't even know. I honestly don't know what the first PC game I played was, but like, by that time, I was already used to like messing around with things on a controller and just trying things and just seeing what happens. I guess when you're an adult, you have less of that try it to see what happens approach because you're in more of like a rigid style of thinking. So it takes a bit longer to get used to the idea that maybe something unexpected is going to have an interaction that makes sense.
In fairness, the instructions at the start explain how to move and how to pick things up, but they do assume that players will just know to use the mouse to look around. Given that she doesn't spend her free time watching me play games on my computer, why would she? I know that a lot of these little issues she ran into in regards to controls and mechanics all seem easy to overcome. And
there actually are a number of games I've seen that do tell you to, like, a lot of action games do tell you to use the right stick to move the camera. Yeah, as a kid, you not only try everything, but you also quickly recognize cause and effect when you press buttons. Very much so. Well, okay. Not necessarily. At a certain point, right? Because I have had younger nephews, or like my younger sister, who I would give the secondary control to that was not plugged in. Doesn't Portal 2 tell you to look around? I don't know. They were playing Portal 1. But at a point, yeah, like if you're playing the game as a kid, you work a lot of stuff out just by trial and error. And you might not get anywhere. Like, when I was playing Spyro, for example, I would, like, I probably ran around the opening area, like, for 3 hours or something. Or when I first played Kingdom Hearts, I probably grinded to level 20 on Destiny Islands. I know I got scanned before I left Destiny Islands, so I was at least level 15. But, like, you just have fun messing with stuff. You're not trying to finish a game. You're just trying to, like, you're in a game world. You're just trying to do things.
A lot of ways they are, but they do still act as small barriers to entry for new players. Even when games have detailed explanations for things, it can sometimes be information overload, and it isn't.
Yeah, there you go. Dark Souls does tell you.
It doesn't. Even when games have detailed explanations for things, it can sometimes.
It doesn't specify that's a stick, but it does at least tell you there are camera controls, right? So Dark Souls at least does something there, but a lot of games are really bad at showing what a stick looks like.
Information overload. And it isn't uncommon for people to skip over explanations accidentally or on purpose.
Very true. Very true.
Reading a bunch of stuff when they just want to.
I've done that many times.
A lot of titles seem to assume that players will have at least some familiarity with controls. So some of the more simple explanations are kind of just left out. And I think the way most people end up learning these basic things that they won't figure out without searching on their own is through other people. For example, back to Mario. I don't remember how I learned to sprint in the game, but as I know, I would not have read the instruction manual.
You almost certainly just held down a button without thinking about it and started sprinting. That's how I worked it out.
There's a pretty decent chance that my brother told me how to do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of his friends had told him, and so on and so on.
Maybe that happened for you, but
only reason
I know for me, the way I worked it out is just I held down a button longer than I had intended to, and I started sprinting. I was like, oh, that makes sense.
And I understand half the things I do in Dark Souls is because I've scoured wikis and message boards on how to get good. Video games are best when they are a communal experience, and a big part of that stems from the sharing of knowledge. Obviously, someone being a backseat gamer can get annoying if they explain how to do everything, but getting assistance when it's needed most can make a game far more enjoyable. It bridges the gap between a games expect players to already know and what they actually do know. Most of the frustration that the lady I live with had while playing boiled down to not being able to figure things out that she didn't know existed, which is something that would have been solved had I not just been a silent observer. Given that I was, though, she found herself continuing to have problems, and one of those is summed up best by her most frequently asked question:
where the fuck am I going?
When it came to the 2D platform.
That can very much be the case in a 3D game. I felt like this in Wukong as well, a little bit. There are a lot of cases where it's not entirely clear what you need to do. Like, once you've played enough games, right? If you see a big door that's open, you know it's a boss room, right? If you see some tower and it's got a fire on it, you know you're walking towards the tower. But if you don't have this background in gaming, I can understand why this is just not something you would think about.
platformers, navigating wasn't especially difficult for her.
Sure,
because
go
the
right.
options were limited, it was pretty easy for her to figure out that she needed to go right and sometimes up. Celeste and Shovel Knight do have a few optional rooms players can go in, but for the most part, whenever she entered one, she could tell it wasn't the path she wanted to take. Although Shovel Knight does have a side room in the tutorial that
Yeah, just go towards the hole that isn't the floor.
heads to the right and seems like the main path despite not being it, and there was a fair amount of disappointment as she realized she did all that work for nothing.
Are you fucking kidding me?
However, for all the 3D games, navigating proved far more difficult. She spent a lot of time for all the 3D games, navigating proved
Just go straight
far
back through
more
the
difficult.
portal.
She spent a lot of time wrestling with the camera in third-person games, and she wasn't all
Yep.
that great at moving and looking around at the same
The camera is always the final boss.
time in first-person ones. Due to her not rotating the camera around a ton, she didn't always get a great sense of her surroundings, so she struggled with figuring out where she was and where she was going. Like in Skyrim, she missed the jump from the tower to the house during the tutorial, and it took a while for her to realize that she had fallen back to the spot where she started. Also, because she wasn't good at focusing her camera, she didn't realize she was supposed to be following Hadvar, so she was sort of just strolling along, trying to get out of the city in her own way. Once she did follow him and got into a building, she was more interested in picking up everything she saw instead of
Put her in Baldur's Gate then. Baldur's Gate has a lot of shit to pick up.
moving forward, which actually is fair in how most people play Skyrim. Either way, she wasn't fully sure where to go. Interestingly, after we finished all the games, I brought up the footage of Skyrim and showed her the compass at the top of the screen, and she said that she hadn't noticed it while playing, as she was mostly just focused on what was directly in front of her. The same thing happened with Doom's compass and even the health bars of enemies and bosses in Dark Souls. She typically noticed waypoints on the screen when they showed up, but she didn't know what they were for, so she often ignored them. Players are hit with
I certainly feel the same way when I'm streaming. There's a lot of basic information that I end up missing. I guess the same could be true if you're overwhelmed by a game as well.
a lot of information when they play games. And for ones who aren't all that comfortable with the basics, a lot of that information's pushed to the
What
side.
have you sent me? What is this?
Over the past few years, I've been running
Oh. It's a Baldur's Gate 3 video. Of course it is. Oh, God.
acting as another barrier for entry. Another thing that confused her was when progression in a level wasn't entirely linear. Like with Dark Souls, she got confused when the level looped back around on itself, and she made the assumption that she had messed up and gone the wrong way. Most of the games she had played before
That's actually a really good point. I am under the assumption, now that I've played a Souls game, right? Like, when I see something loops back, I'm like, oh, that's a shortcut to get back to that original location. But I can see how if you loop back as a new person and you don't really know the fact that the game is heavy on doing loopbacks, you might think you got lost somewhere and walked all the way back to the start. Metroidvanias are hard for a lot because the massive backtracking, having to memorize location for hints and items. Old Metroidvania, yes. A lot of newer games do have maps that have markers. Like, if you go play, Ender Lilies, for example, a lot of areas have markers to tell you that you missed something there.
Dark Souls had typical progression, so finding herself back near where she started felt odd. Even the 3D games that seemed like they might be more straightforward had a few things that ended up being confusing
Doom
for her.
is not
For example, in Uncharted 2, what a player can climb is indicated by being colored yellow, but that wasn't obvious to her.
Yeah, the yellow paint doesn't work for someone who's not used to yellow paint.
So she constantly tried to climb things that just looked like they could be climbed. And then she questioned why she had to take the longer, more roundabout path.
When the yellow paint actually makes the game worse. You know what? I agree with her. Absolutely base take.
When there were perfectly good handholds right above her. A similar
Yep.
issue with signaling happened with The Last of Us as well. There's a part where the player has to run through a city to escape, and a gas station explodes, causing street lamps and other things to block the road ahead. My wife noticed a little gap on the sidewalk that was untouched by fire, so she kept trying to run through that to get out. But every time
Yep.
she did, the infected came and killed her. This made her think that the issue wasn't with it being the wrong way to go, but rather with her not being fast enough. So she kept trying that same path over and over before finally finding the right way. With game design, there's often a battle between
Yep. Invisible walls make children cry. If it looks like a way that you can go, it should be a way that you can go. If you don't want players to go there, don't let them go there. Put a wall there. Put a blockade there. Put fire there. Put something there so players can't go over there.
Between having a level look realistic and making it easy to navigate.
Especially in that case, like there wouldn't be anything weird with there being a blockade there, or there being like the fire extending across. Like that would be completely normal. It would make entire sense for the scene. They just assume players weren't going to go there, though.
For example, Naughty Dog tried to make the city feel more natural by not having every path be physically blocked off. And while more experienced players will most likely see the explosion and assume they should go a different way, the game falls short on helping players who don't
is there any reason why this car couldn't be slightly further over there? There's no reason for it.
Understand what they're supposed to do. By having the signal be the explosion, but the consequence being an attack by the infected, she learned the wrong lesson. And this sort of thing ended up happening to her a fair amount throughout the process, even with things that had nothing to do with navigation. Sometimes she just interpreted the information the game was giving her in the wrong way, and she found herself
me right there. That is me right there when I got to that segment.
The idea that some games teach players how to play simply through gameplay and level design is a pretty common talking point in the video game community. I'm a firm believer that a lot of games do this, and watching her play reaffirmed that thought. For example, in Doom, her initial instinct was to stay as far away from enemies as possible, because she didn't feel all that comfortable with the controls of a first-person shooter. However, once she came across enemies who threw fireballs at her from a distance that did way more damage than anything she could do from that same range, she started to realize that her best bet was to get close to enemies and either beat the crap out of them or use the shotgun. Ultimately, Doom is meant to be played this way. The glory kill system and the handful of weapons that are powerful at close range are included to push a fast-paced, action-packed fighting style. And having one of the first rooms be extremely difficult to beat without playing this way sets the expectation for the rest of the game. It took her a fair bit of banging her head against the wall to get past this room, but once she did, she was better at the core mechanics of the game than when she started. With that said, what I found even more interesting than when she learned the right lessons of how to play a game through gameplay was when she learned the wrong ones. The first instance of this that I
Just
noticed
attack the other dude, yeah,
while playing
brother.
Mario 1-1. At the beginning of the level, there's a question mark box with a mushroom in it. She had some familiarity with the Mario franchise, so she knew that mushrooms were good to get. However, after hitting the box, she jumped into a different block, causing the mushroom to change directions and go off the left side of the screen, out of reach. She didn't register that she had caused the mushroom to change directions, leading her to the assumption that mushrooms would always end up going to the left. When she got to another block that she suspected held the mushroom, she hit it and immediately moved to the left to grab it before it went off screen, and, well... This was a far less intrusive lesson to get wrong than the ones that came up while she played Celeste and Shovel Knight. The tutorial of Celeste is a pretty simple stage that ends with the player learning how to dash, which is arguably the most important and useful mechanic in the game. The lady I live with interpreted the prompt to mean that the only way to dash was by doing it at an upward angle, pretty much crippling her ability to do screens effectively until after 15 minutes or so when she accidentally dashed horizontally and realized her moveset was wider than she had thought. With Shovel Knight, early on she died from hitting this bubble. A bag of gold popped out and hovered near it. On her next time through, she jumped on the bubble and the bag at the same time and assumed that both things had damaged her, causing her to think that the bags of gold were an enemy of some sort. So when she came across them after that, she would either try to attack them or actively avoid them. As she wasn't paying terribly close attention to the HUD, she never realized what they actually did. I'm not saying that these things are the fault.
That's an interesting correlation to make. Huh. Again, it's another thing, right? Like, if you see a bag of money in a game, you know what that is if you're someone who's played a bunch of games before. Like, that's... If you played Spyro, you know what a money bag is. If you played basically any mascot platformer, you know what a money bag is. You know that's a good thing. Huh. Did you really watch these other videos in future streams?
It is interesting.
Definitely gonna check some of them out for sure.
On screen can be misunderstood. These sort of things can happen to players of all skill levels, but given her lack of experience, she didn't have much else to go on to challenge the lessons she thought she had learned. I found the disconnect between how she thought games worked and how they actually worked to be pretty intriguing. And as I focused more on those differences,
She went into the menu to get the key out.
started to notice a sort of trend with every title she played. That being,
Yep.
when most people talk about what any video game is like, there's often a greater focus on the general actions players can do rather than the limitations that make it possible for the game to function. For example, Mass Effect could be described as a role-playing game where, among other things, players get the opportunity to talk to and form relationships with various characters across the universe. People who play a lot of games will most likely go in understanding that this actually means players will be able to form relationships with a predetermined cast of characters by choosing responses from a set of limited dialogue options. As it turns out, this formula makes for a really great series, but there is a gap between what a game sounds like and what it actually looks like. And I think for people who don't end up playing a lot of games, but have to suffer through listening to their friends or partners talk about them, they get a warped perception about what players can do in a title because they don't understand.
It's something that Josh Strife has talked about, where to really enjoy a game, you have to try to enjoy a game. The game can only do so much. If you're not willing to give some of yourself to it, you're not going to get anything out of the game. And if you don't know what you're supposed to be getting out of a game, I can understand why you wouldn't really know how to properly approach that.
Or know the systems that games use in order to give these grand sounding experiences. Where I know to apply a sort of video game logic to any title I play, the lady I live with was always trying to apply real world logic. Like in the Doom tutorial, there's a gore nest that the player needs to destroy. A waypoint marker shows up on it, which when I first played, I knew meant I needed to go up to it and most likely hit a button prompt. When my wife played, she didn't know what the marker meant, so her initial instinct wasn't to walk right up to it. Instead, she noticed while messing around that the red barrels exploded, so she had the idea to try to push one of the barrels towards the nest to blow it up. And this is objective.
Taking the, you know what? Maybe you should have played Half-Life then.
More interesting than just pressing a button to destroy it. But of course, it didn't work. Throughout the various games, a pretty common question she asked was, why can't I do it this way? And my response was, because. The deeper answer is that limitations exist in games because there are only so many potential inputs a title can have, meaning there are a finite number of ways a player can interact with things. If developers tried to program in every possible way a player might think about interacting with something, games would just never come out. I'm used to these limitations. I actually appreciate them in a lot of instances. However, for her, she got frustrated when the ideas she came up with didn't work, like while scaling the train in
Yeah, if you think it's an enemy, you would try to do that.
Uncharted 2, she reached a point where she wanted to swing from a pipe and through a window. So when she realized she had to take the predetermined path that didn't take much more than pressing left, she felt disappointed because, yeah, her idea was cooler. In Skyrim, as Alduin began attacking the city, she found a spot in a house and figured she'd just wait it out until he left. But due to the scripted nature of this part of the game, that plan didn't work, forcing her to follow the path the game wanted her to follow. In turn, this took away all the tension of this section because she knew she could take as long as she wanted and nothing bad would happen. Hiding in a house isn't that fun of a way to play a game, but her not being able to made it feel like she lost some agency. Her expectations for what she thought she could do in each game were always different than the reality, and I think as she realized that games were more simple than she had first assumed, some of the intrigue about them faded.
Again, this is what Josh was saying, where you need to approach a game with the correct mindset, but no, she's not wrong. That's the thing. Falling Rock segment's not fun gameplay. No, she's completely right that segment is awful. And the Skyrim segment, the Skyrim opening that you're forced to just go forward is not a great segment. And this is like, speedrunners are at the point where they skip most of it anyway. She may be just a bit disappointed in video games, but she would be great in a D&D party. Oh, absolutely. No, she clearly has an interest in game mechanics, but isn't a fan of the limitations of most video games. Once you have an idea of what a video game is, you know how to enjoy it. But if you don't know, and you've heard all these great things about video games, I can see why you'd have this impression that, like, it just doesn't seem fun. Because it gives you a sense of agency, but not the level that you would expect. Like, it's more agency than you get from a movie or a book. But it's not the level of agency that you assume that you get based on what people have said. Like, if you hear someone talk about, like, Skyrim, like, oh, I built this, like, stealth build, and I, like, snuck up on these giants, and I did this, and, like, oh, that's so cool. Or, like, there are certain games out there that give you a lot of agency in certain things, like, Tears of the Kingdom, right? With its building system. Or Stardew Valley with its farm system. But you have to know what to expect from the agency. What about Minecraft? I think Minecraft would be something that she would really appreciate.
For the lady I live with, the thing she hated more than anything else about this experiment was having to replace...
Because it's a very simple game, and there are simple interactions, but I think they make a lot more sense than something a lot more complex like Dark Souls. And yeah, modern Minecraft has a lot of, like, weirdness to it, sure, but the core fundamentals of Minecraft, I think she would really appreciate.
Sections of a level over and over again after dying. Had I not told her to keep trying on a
There's a
handful
Minecraft
of the
video,
game,
isn't
she
there?
would have stopped.
There's a Minecraft video. Of course there's a fucking Minecraft video. Of course there is a Minecraft video.
Far sooner because it was understandably frustrating.
I'll
With that
chuck
said,
that one on my
when
list.
she did stick with games that
We're
frustrated
not gonna watch
her
it
and
today.
ended up beating the parts that she struggled with, she found it exhilarating. I think this trade-off of dealing with frustration so that the excitement of beating something is all that much sweeter is one that people who play a lot of games not only understand but look for. However, trying to pitch that she should spend her free time doing something that actively frustrates her so that the few moments where she succeeds feel glorious is a bit of a tough look. This little test has me questioning how
getting into gaming like this as an adult, like, okay, there is a reason, right, why there is a lot of people who don't play video games, but they play FIFA, right? Or they don't play video games, but they play NBA 2K. Or they don't play video games, but they play Genshin Impact. It is a lot easier to get someone who is not a fan of video games generally to play one video game and get very dedicated to it, especially when it's something they can attach to their, like, real world knowledge. Like, much like with FIFA, or I guess it's FC 2024 now, whatever. They've rebranded it because they want to give FIFA more money. Like, if you're a fan of football, or you're a fan of basketball, or you're a fan of racing games, like, a lot of people like the F1 games, or Forza, for example, and that's the only thing they play, but you have some real-world foundation on how that's supposed to work. Like, if you're playing FIFA, for example, you don't expect to be able to punch on with someone, or to be able to do all of these things that just don't fit within the rule set of soccer, so you already have that, like, knowledge of how to appreciate football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, based on your real-world knowledge of how that sport already functions. Or same in NBA 2K, or same in Forza. Like, if you're a car guy and you play Forza, you understand what a car is, how cars function, how cars are supposed to drive. So you don't get disappointed when a car behaves like a car, right? But if you're playing a game like Mario and you don't really have, like, the same level of, I guess, real-world comparison for it. How I play Forza was reselling cars in the auction house and flipping them, and then just joyriding. That's another approach, but that's not like the that's the gamer approach, not the Forza player approach.
I became interested in video games in the first place. I don't remember how they became such a big part of my life. I don't know how I got to the point where I could look at a compass at
You
the top.
played it as a child, and now you have Stockholm Syndrome. That's how. Like, I'm just gonna be straight with you, right? Like, that's how you got into video games. You've played them your entire life, and now you're addicted. Now you have Stockholm Syndrome. Now you will never leave. You can never escape once you've begun. My dad loved Gran Turismo on PS1 because it allowed fine-tuning the car.
of a screen and know what to expect from every marker without looking them up. I don't know how I first learned about stamina bars and the various ways to make sure I don't run out of energy. I don't know how I became, I guess, fluent in the language of video games. I'm just glad that I learned the basics when I was young enough to not care about spending hours on one level. For a better understanding...
That is exactly how you learned. You learned as a child when you had zero responsibilities. Your responsibility when you learned to play video games is, have I done my homework? Like, that's maybe not even that. Maybe you were even younger than having homework. It was, have you put your toys away? Right? And that was the only thing you had to do that day. Maybe you were going to go hang out with your friends. Maybe you had to, like, I don't know. Maybe you had to, like, help do some other housework. Like, your parents wanted you to help weed the garden. But you didn't have anything else. You could spend 8 hours a day you could spend 8 hours on Destiny Islands. And that was fine because you didn't have anything else to do. Especially if you didn't have many games. That's the other thing. As a kid, I got like one game a year. So I enjoyed a game, whether I liked it or not. Like, I played Kingdom Hearts 1 for like probably hundreds of hours, like on my first playthrough. I played all of these games for way longer than there is content to be played because that was the only thing I had, and you learn a lot when you just don't have anything else to do.
How inexperienced players approach video games, I need to run a much wider and more complex study that tests in a more robust way than just sitting down to watch my wife play video games a few times. But I did find it interesting to compare how wildly different my approach to games is to hers. And while I definitely don't have enough definitive information to make any sort of legitimate conclusion about how inexperienced players approach games, I do want to say this. In a similar way to how it is harder to learn a language as an adult, it's harder to get into...
To be fair, kicking is really annoying in Dark Souls 1. There are so many cases where I don't act. I try to kick and I do an attack instead. I fucking hate kicking.
Video games after a lifetime of not playing them. And from what I've seen, that seems to have less to do with interest and more to do with struggling to get over the barriers that exist for new players. Like, if you don't know how to read, why would you pick up a book? What I'm getting at is if someone you know who doesn't play games expresses interest in trying one, don't force them to be in an experiment where you give no guidance and mostly just watch them struggle with something that they never learned how to do.
By the way, in case it was unclear, she is still as... I'm aware, yes.
It instead.
I know they didn't get a divorce because of the video.
And now you have a very not annoying at all item. That I can hit. Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Fucking get it.
You can use that to like wake things up and to break stuff.
Ooh. Put that in the video. You should just take that snippet. Don't put that in the video.
There was literally nothing better to do than play a video game. Well, for me as well, I lived in a rural place and my friends were like a drive away, right? Like the place I grew up, like, as, like, a really young kid, we had, like, 3 acres. Because we were in the middle of nowhere. My school had 60 students. So, it was, like, a drive to get to my friend's house. So, I couldn't even go and bike there anyway. Because it was, like, probably a 20 or 30-minute drive to get there. When I moved, like, back to South Australia, I did have friends on my street. I did have friends I could bike to. So, it was a bit different then. But I first got into gaming when there were not kids around, when there were not friends that I could just go to their houses. Like, the internet wasn't a thing when I was a kid. The internet was a thing when I was a kid, but we didn't have internet. Both my parents grew up on farms. We lived in rural Queensland. We could get dial-up. My parents didn't want the internet. They didn't know what the internet was. They didn't know why you would want the internet. We had internet at school, but that was the only time I used the internet. I think one of my friends also had... Yeah, one of my friends also had the internet as well. But, like, for the most part, yeah, nothing at all. That's a really good video. That's honestly a really good video. Here is the channel. I will definitely have to check out more of his stuff in the future. I guess the rural part may have been important for getting me into computers as well. That and Raspberry Pi for the win. I recommend Rasputin's video on casual gamers next in a future stream. Is that a recent one? Gaming for a non-gamer. Elden Ring! Oh, God. Okay, it's an old one. I'll find it afterwards then. That was a good video. I really appreciate that. I think he made a lot of good points. And I think a lot of it does apply to, like, when I was early learning games as well. And I've actually had my mum, like, try to play games in the past a couple of times. She can handle kart races. That's pretty much it. I think the thing with kart races is it kind of goes back to the thing I was saying about, like, racing games. It gives you something to ground things on. Like, you understand how like, most people have a understanding of how a go-kart functions, right? If they don't know how a go-kart functions, they know how a car functions, right? Like, they can apply that real-world knowledge to this thing that's in a video game. Maybe they don't understand, like, power-ups and stuff like that, but the core gameplay, and then obviously games like Mario Party make sense because Mario Party is basically a digital board game. Maybe the mini games are weird and don't make sense, but like the core gameplay makes a lot of sense. The weird ways where I've got confused was particularly interesting, like misunderstanding prompts, how enemies and items work. Yeah, when she tried to go into her inventory to use a key. I have tried to do the same thing as well. The Celeste diagonal prompt. Yeah, I thought Celeste introduced dashing before that point. Maybe not, though. I think if you're gonna get someone into gaming, it needs to be something that is either hyper-linear, like a 2D side-scroller, or a 3D game that is, like, very straightforward where you need to go, or it needs to be something where there is no direction, like a Minecraft, for example, where there is no wrong way to play Minecraft. Like, if you don't build a house, that's fine. If you don't start chopping trees, that's fine. Like, you can do whatever you want. If you just want to start, like, if you want to find a village and get stuff there, that's fine. If you just want to dig down, that's fine. Like, there's no wrong way to do it. There's no guidance there. But when the game has a clear thing it wants you to do, but it's not entirely clear to someone who's new that that is what you should be doing, I get why you would have some frustration there.